I'm going to be showing you how tracking numbers and constructing solutions ties in well to each other, and how I'm actively just building out and implementing this in order of tracking numbers, just understanding what is going on with the data, and then using that to ultimately craft our solutions. With the mission of these builds is to basically show you our builds raw and real, basically show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that we're actively implementing, and also just showing you, documenting what it is that we're actively using in terms of mental models and frameworks, and to solve really big problems where it hurts for organizations in terms of chaos, and also just to build a network of visionaries, people that get what it is that we're building, and also just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So how I'm actually building this is broken down into 5 simple steps, as always, with number one being measure what matters. And why this is key is numbers are my compass, and they guide every move that I make. Ultimately, just saying, if you don't understand, or if I don't understand the numbers, then I'm not going to know what to do. And data is the number one thing that powers what it is that we're building. So if we understand, like, hey, we're plugging in AI, for example, into this specific workflow, and it's pumping out XYZ ROI, and it's below our KPI, then I solely just understand that, hey, it might not be worth plugging this specific role into this place, and ultimately just change that. Because if you don't know where the numbers, your churn rates, your how many clients you're getting per month, you ultimately just are shooting blind, and that is the worst thing that you could possibly do, especially for us in what we're doing, where we need a high level of accuracy for what it is that we're building. So we're just ultimately just striving to say, hey, we need data that actually tests, that actually goes through our validation and is actually accurate, ultimately allowing us to just ultimately just build, and also understand what it is that we're building by also using data and also tracking it, which is the number one most important thing, just understanding the data before you construct. Because if you construct without understanding the data, you get lost in what it is that you're building, and ultimately data just guides you in ways that not using data doesn't guide you at all. And what I'm actively doing is, hey, saying tracking time per client per planner, saying, hey, hit 20 hours per week for this one, and then we're aiming for 30. Basically just saying, hey, we're gathering data from these specific core things that they use in a daily workflow. Say, hey, they're invoicing manually, which then they have to wait for them to send out the invoices, and then person has to sign it, and then they have to send them back, which ultimately results in 2-3 days worth of delays. And then just ultimately just streamlining the entire process, and then tracking that to saying, hey, how long is this process now getting done versus how it was getting done before, and ultimately just logging it. And error rates, for example, saying, hey, vendor delays are 25%, let's cut that down as much as possible, saying, hey, what is actually causing vendor delays? Is it that people are specifically just not understanding what it is that they need to do? And if so, what systems and measures can we put down in place in order just to help them understand what it is that we're actively doing, that they're actively doing, and ultimately just help them craft the solution? Because real-time logs and error counts do matter. So just having those real-time logs saying, hey, in real time this is what we're seeing, and in error logs this is also what we're seeing. Are people truly understanding what it is that they need to do in terms of your specific workflow? And if not, how can we then solve for that, saying, hey, we need to cut this down from KPI to say, hey, we're aiming for 10% in vendor delays, so now how do we reduce that from 25, how do we get to that from 25%? And ultimately just cutting down and trusting and focusing on those specific three core pillars, and just ultimately just understanding that helps us understand a lot further into the future. And the lesson that I've learned from this is, if you don't measure it, you can't fix it. Ultimately saying, hey, if you don't have the data, you ultimately can't fix what it is that you're bringing a solution for, because you have no metric to go by. And metric is the number one thing that's going to guide you in terms of your business, and ultimately just crafting the solution as well, because ultimately the numbers are your truth. And that is something that I've actively and am actively implementing into a daily basis, to say, hey, the numbers don't lie, they are my truth, and this is what I'm specifically building for. And we just corely need to understand what it is that we're building based on the numbers. And the first principles question that I like to ask here is, what's the one number that, if improved, would have the biggest impact on my mission, which ultimately can be down to a variety of factors. Saying, hey, Is it that we're not getting projects done in time, or if so, what is the time that we getting them done in versus the previous month, and what KPI do we need to put in place, and how are we measuring those systems that we have in place in order to hit those deadlines? And ultimately just solely just understanding that and just asking those questions, which ultimately unlock the fundamental truths of what it is that we're looking for, and ultimately just using then, which ties into the second point of data into code. And why this is key is tracking is pointless without action. Saying, hey, I build fast from data, ultimately saying, hey, if we get data, we need to build fast or build an MVP specifically from this data so that we can test it out and just use it in order to craft the solution that we're crafting for. And actively just implementing data to say, hey, data is the number one priority that we need to focus on, and also incorporating a bit of feedback into that to say, hey, are we actually tracking the right thing into the data that we're getting, and how do we craft that in a manner that it is ultimately just is as accurate as possible. And what I'm doing, for example, is built a Python script or just building a custom solution like we normally do for vendor sync automations to say, hey, we want to build this custom Python script in order to solve this automation problems for planners for vendor syncs specifically, and saying, hey, planners hated 5-hour manual updates, now it's 5 minutes, solely because of this automation, just basically automating the process from a custom solution, not just patching and saying, hey, this works, but ultimately just understanding the data based on what it is that we need to build. But ultimately sometimes it normally comes from saying, hey, this person or this business doesn't need a fully custom solution, and that's okay, but let's just create a Python script that will allow them to just automate their entire process and just hook up and plug all the automations that we need to, just solely just understanding how to basically reduce the friction within their workflow. And plain spotted, fix coded, and chaos killed, ultimately just killing the chaos from the simple solution and just saying, hey, we coded it, now it's solved. And then we test it for data, which is the number one thing, like I always say, is saying, hey, data is going to guide what it is that we're building, and the numbers don't lie, and they ultimately just guide us to what it is that we're ultimately building for. And then the lesson that I've learned here is solutions come from pain points, not guesses. Build what hurts, ultimately just saying, hey, these solutions come from pain points, and those pain points must be measured in order to better understand the solution that we're crafting for into the future. And ultimately saying, hey, this solution or this problem that you may be having, in order for us to provide a solution, it needs to be quantified. It needs to have it needs to have a impact on the business that is quantifiable, and in order to do that, we just need to solely just understand that and ask the question of what's the root cause of this pain, and what's the simplest way to solve this with what I have. Saying, hey, we have the tools at this disposal, and how can we actively just solve this using the data that we need, of saying, hey, we're just taking a first principles approach to asking the questions, which ultimately lead to building the answer, which is way more easier to then break down, and then ultimately leads to the third point, which is refine until it's gold. Saying, hey, untested builds are half baked, numbers tell me if it works, to saying, hey, if we haven't tested it and if we don't solely understand from the root fundamental of the numbers, are the numbers actually matching in what it is that we're building, then hey, it's half baked. It's not fully used the analytics that we should be using in order to build this solution. Saying, hey, if we're aiming for saving 30 hours per month, then we say, hey, we're crafting the solution specifically to solve 30 hours per month, and how best do we go through that, or how best do we approach that in 3 simple steps. And then ultimately how I'm doing it is saying, hey, testing vendor syncs on prototype, save 25 hours but hit 2 bugs. Bugs are the number one thing that you're constantly just gonna hit, especially if you're building custom builds. So that's why testing needs a very rigorous process in order to say, hey, we need to test for 2-3 weeks in order to just get everything super dialed in order of the build that we are actively building for, and just saying, hey, we're going to take this time to build this solution, but in order to do that, we need to have a tailored system specifically for solving bugs. So saying, hey, tweaked it in 2 hours, now it's 26 hours saved. So this ultimately just comes from if it's custom or if it's not custom. So ultimately the whole vision that I was speaking about just now is ultimately if we're building a full-fledged custom backend system where we need a week or two just ultimately to just constantly just test and refine what it is that we're building, with a daily check of saying, hey, what are the numbers now? Are we actually saving time or are we not saving time? And then ultimately just having that super dialed in and ultimately just building for that. And the lesson that I've learned here is testing isn't optimal. It's how you turn good into great. Ultimately just saying, hey, we have to refine until it's gold. We just constantly need to test until we understand what it is that we're building and also understand the numbers in that. And that also ties together of the first principles question of asking, what's the smallest test I can run to validate this solution's impact? And usually this comes from a variety of things. It can say, hey, the smallest test we can run from this to validate it is saying, hey, are the vendors syncing in less than 10 hours? Are they syncing in 10 minutes? Or are the systems simply just streamlining the processes? Or invoices getting sent out and getting sent back within a day, within 2 hours? How long is this process running for? And then just testing for that. And then once it works, then we have validity on proof of concept, and then we can ultimately just run with that, which ultimately just leads to the fourth point, which is from one to many, basically scaling out the solution, saying, hey, how can we possibly solve this one specific problem and then scale that for many other businesses within different verticals as well. And the why it's key is one fix is good for proof of concept. Like I just said, scaling it changes the game in order to saying, hey, we solve one problem, but now let's take it a step further and solve it for multiple other businesses. And why I'm doing this is expanding vendor sync to 30 planners, saying, hey, with the JavaScript web app dashboard, saying here's real-time chaos killing stats, to saying, hey, here are the numbers, here's what we're building, and this is what we're actively just building for scale for, and here it is, so that you guys can see what it is that we're actively building. And if you like it, we'll work together. If not, that's also good. What feedback can we also get from that? Because ultimately data is your feedback on how to build into the future. Similar to how people say, hey, I like XYZ, data tells you that without actively having to go out and say, hey, what are your thoughts, and wait for that feedback. It ultimately just gives you feedback in real time, especially when you're testing things. And the lesson that I've learned from this is scaling isn't just more users, it's more impact measured and multiplied, which the number one thing for here is impact needs to be measured and also multiplied for it to actually have impact in on scale for different verticals. And the first principles question I like to ask here is, what's one core element that makes this solution scalable, and how can I amplify it? Ultimately just asking the question of, hey, we have this dashboard, how can I ultimately just amplify it across different verticals so that it ultimately just saves a lot of time in terms of different businesses, saying, hey, let's build this one dashboard and let's tie XYZ vendor syncs, let's tie in invoices, let's tie in all the core business functions into one specific dashboard that allows them to take actionable steps and ultimately just scale that into the future. And this ultimately just is impact driven and also just focuses solely on the numbers as well. And which also ties into the fifth point, which ultimately just ties everything together, which is numbers tell the story, which we can all ultimately see from this. And why this is key is numbers aren't just data, they're proof that I'm winning. Simply saying, hey, if these numbers are winning or below or above our KPI, we're either winning or losing. And how can we combat that? By simply just testing a lot of different needs that we need to test out more, and just solely just understanding that and just scaling it into the future. And how I'm doing this is nightly check-in, saying, hey, what chaos did I kill today? Every planner saved pushes me forward towards the chaos OS impact, and saying, hey, we're building an impactful product and this is how we're actively building it, and we want to scale it up into different verticals for different business owners. But right now we're starting with our specific client avatar and we're just scaling that specifically for them so that we solely just understand what is the core issues or the core elements that encompass what it is that we're building, and saying, hey, numbers aren't your scoreboard, use them to stay hungry, to ultimately say, hey, we need to set KPIs, because ultimately KPIs let you know, like, are you on track or are you below or just what you need to improve, and ultimately using that as our North Star to guide us in the solutions that we're actively building, and using this to ultimately just allow us to scale into the future, which ultimately leads to the first principles question that I like to ask that ties everything together is, what's the ultimate metric that defines my success for my vision, and how close am I today? Is it how many people we're serving? Is it the impact that we have? Is it the number of hours that we're saving on a weekly basis? These are the questions that I like to ask myself to say, hey, are we below 20, 30 hours per month that we're saving for, or per week? Are we below that or are we above that? And that ultimately just ties the vision together with the ultimate metrics to say, hey, we're ultimately just building based off of numbers, and these numbers are allowing us to craft a solution that ultimately allows us to create value into the customers that we're working with, and also just allows us to build better into the future and to use better mental models. And if you guys like this video, make sure to connect with me on X, on Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.